there's a fascinating story that Serge Klarsfeld, now quite old, who's a very famous Nazi hunter, said he's going to vote for Marine Le Pen's party. And, somebody said, what? And he said, look, the left is, openly, visibly anti-Semitic, not just anti-Israel. And he said between people who really hate Jews and people who seem not to hate them, at least, I'm going to vote for the ones who don't.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs and dedicated to the proposition articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and I'm rejoined by my partner in all things strategy and partner in crime, Eliot Cohen, the Robert E. Osgood Professor of Strategy at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., and the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Eliot, welcome back.
Well, I'm not actually back yet. I'm still in the Boston area. We spent a few days with family on Cape Cod, where it was a balmy 75 degrees most of the time. And now I'm in Boston, showing one of our grandchildren around my hometown, which has changed a lot. And as a conservative, I hate change, but I digress, as I usually do.
Well, change comes to all things, and we're in the midst of election season that may bring change to the United States, but also elections elsewhere that are significant for American foreign policy, including across the pond in the UK, where our Britons will vote on July 4th, in France, where President Macron has, perhaps ill-advisedly called a snap election after the European elections showed big gains by the far right, and an Iranian presidential election to replace the unlamented, departed former president of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi. So why don't we start with the UK election, which looks like it could be an extinction event for the Conservative Party, for the Tories. What do you think is going to happen? And what do you think the implications will be?
The polls really are stunning. The last one I saw is the Tories go down to 53 seats. Rishi Sunak, the prime minister, loses his seat. I mean, we'll see what happens on the day. But, just to be clear, that would give Labour a majority of 300 seats. And I think it does represent something more than just, the fact that they've been kicking around for 14 years and people are sick of it. I think it's a combination of a whole bunch of things that are going on. And you do wonder whether they can recover from a thrashing that thorough. And I have to say I'm a little bit baffled because they've botched a whole bunch of things. There's no question about it, particularly Brexit. Although, I don't know about you, but my feeling on the Brexit thing is that has become a kind of gigantic red herring. The ills of Great Britain have to do with things like a wildly inefficient and unaffordable national health service, some terrific social problems, which are on exhibit in cities like Bradford, but even on the streets of London, infrastructure issues, the trains having lots of difficulty, wrestling with issues like immigration. So I don't think this is just about Brexit. I think it is something deeper. It will be a big deal because this is the oldest political party in the world. And that is, if that gets blown up, that is something. Last thing I'd say is just from the selfish point of view of foreign policy, Labour will be fine on Ukraine, I think. Keir Starmer, who is not a man who's particularly ideological, as far as I can tell, will be, sort of center left on the Middle East and good on NATO. But it's not clear that Labour has any solutions to Britain's ills. And so it's not at all clear, I think, that what comes out of this is a party that can really restore British self-confidence. What do you think?
Yeah, I largely agree with all that. I guess, I thought Brexit was a close call. And I thought I kind of saw it as like a 51-49 for leave. In retrospect, I kind of regret. I regret having come down on that side, in part because it's clear that the Leave group, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and all those people had no plan. They had no clue what they were going to do. And while I take your point that Britain's ills run far deeper than Brexit, Brexit clearly has worsened most of these problems, not ameliorated them. And their mismanagement of it has, sucked the oxygen out of the air politically in Britain for a number of years and prevented people from really addressing some of the other issues you mentioned. I mean, some of the polling I've seen suggests that Nigel Farage and the Reform Party will actually come in at least at the same level, maybe ahead of the Tories. And so one question I have is, do the Tories come back from this, or do they go the way of the Liberal Party, which essentially disappeared after World War One? I don't know the answer to that, but obviously, as you say, it's one of the oldest political parties in the world, and its disappearance would obviously have some knock-on political effects in Britain. I kind of agree with you. I don't think there's going to be a big change, certainly on Ukraine, and even on something I might have worried about a few years ago, which is the British nuclear deterrent. David Lammy and John Healey have been pretty clear, the shadow Foreign Secretary and Secretary of State for Defense, that they're going to continue to support continuous at-sea deterrence. So I don't think you'll see much change there. But to have one of our closest allies sort of just destabilized politically is just, I think, not a good thing for us.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. If I could just go back to Brexit, because I think this is of more than historical interest. I mean, I was sort of where you were, 51-49 in favor of Brexit. By the way, I didn't have any British friends who took that position. And I mean, it was, people were really hard over, particularly the Remainers, and it was practically religious in its intensity. But it wasn't just that they didn't have a plan; it was they were profoundly incompetent at execution, and I'm beginning to think that's part of the crisis of Western governments and maybe of Western democracy. It is a crisis of public confidence in the ability of government to do things intelligently, competently, decisively, effectively. So I suspect, for example, the whole COVID shambles in the UK plays a large role in it, as it does here, as it does in a lot of other countries. And so I think that may be a common thread with this kind of mass discontent. I mean, I think I may have mentioned this in an earlier podcast. I was in London the day after Brexit, and I was asked to give a talk at Policy Exchange. So fools walk in where angels fear to tread. And I said, look, this looks to me as if it's a crisis of the elites. That is to say, the elites have lost legitimacy. Some of this goes back to 2008 and the financial crisis. Some of it goes on before, but where there's just this huge disjunction between what average human beings believe and the world that they experience, their economic lives, their cultural lives, and what a very wealthy, urbanized elite believe and feel. And I think we see this manifested. You look at our college campuses. It is the elite institutions which have been going bonkers in really unsavory ways. particularly over the Middle East, but not just over that. And they're just not in the same place as the rest of the country. And that, I think that is part of the underlying reason for how we get Trump.
Yeah, and you see some of the same phenomena you were just describing in terms of government competence and elite failure, certainly in what's gone on in France. I
Yes.
mean, Macron is sort of the epitome of the énarque, the graduate of the National School of Administration who has a career in government and then has high office, but seems very out of touch with the public. I mean, his gamble seems to be that after in the European parliamentary elections, this big surge of support for Marine Le Pen's party, a kind of cleaned up version of the old National Front that her father led, with a very kind of clever young spokesperson, Jordan Bardella, who's not even 30, but might end up being prime minister, given what the polls seem to show. I mean, what do you think Macron was thinking? And that could be an election where there are some foreign policy, consequences as a result of the outcome, depending on how it goes.
Yeah, I think the way I've always thought about Macron is too clever by half. And we saw that before in these ridiculous attempts to reach out to Putin, which were doomed to failure. He then makes decisions very quickly because he's a man of, I think, tremendous self-confidence. And you don't get the feeling that he surrounds himself with people who really can challenge his judgments, which is great weakness in any political leader, as you and I have discussed. It may also be the case that this is one of those instances where the elites say, well, there's no possible way that anybody's going to vote really for Marine Le Pen and her party, and they may be misjudging it. There's a fascinating story that Serge Klarsfeld, now quite old, is a very famous Nazi hunter, said he's going to vote for Marine Le Pen's party, and somebody said, what? And he said, look, the left is, openly, visibly anti-Semitic, not just anti-Israel. And he said, between people who really hate Jews and people who seem not to hate them, at least, I'm going to vote for the ones who don't. And, that obviously the Jewish population in France is small, but it's indicative, I think, of something considerably deeper. What difference it makes, you and I will talk about Donald Trump later on. I'm not entirely sure. I think the Meloni story in Italy is a very interesting one. Everybody was going on and on. This is a party descended from the fascists. They'll be in Putin's hip pocket. This is the end of Italian democracy. No. She's been a moderately effective populist. Moderately. I mean, she hasn't, but they haven't, as far as I can tell, grotesquely mishandled anything. And, you don't have men in black leather overcoats making enemies of the regime drink castor oil, which is what used to happen in the old days.
Yeah, and she's been a pretty staunch transatlanticist and supporter of aid to Ukraine. I do think there's a difference. Le Pen and Bardella have been at some pains to suggest that they would continue to support Ukraine, but I think there's plenty of reason to believe that is not how they will actually behave, in office. And I think the difference between Meloni and Le Pen is Le Pen's party has taken lots of money from Putin over the years, and Meloni's did not. I mean, Meloni has been pretty clean on that score. I mean, Matteo Salvini, the other, sort of leader of the ultra right in Italy, has, been very pro Putin and taken money from the Kremlin. But I think that's the difference in France, and I worry a lot that an RN government in France, or even one where it was the leading element, uh, would be really a problem over time, but for transatlantic purposes and with Ukraine. And I guess, I saw the story about Klarsfeld, and I kind of get it, which is there's an element of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Because a big source of anti-Semitism in France today, as opposed to 100 years ago, is the immigration, of large Muslim populations into France. The RN, of course, is famously an anti-immigrant party. So there's that. And on the economic side, the problem here is that Macron called an election in which it's likely his guys are going to get shut out by both the right and the left, because the left has formed a kind of new Popular Front in order to stop the fascists, having, perhaps overlearned the lessons of the 1930s. And the dominant force is La France Insoumise, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who has been virulently anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, and also kind of dominating the left economic platform, which I think most economists believe would completely immiserate France and destroy France. So caught between those two alternatives, with Macron maybe not even being a factor, I think is playing to Le Pen's strength.
It does seem to me that one of the things that we're living through is a period where parties don't do, or certainly don't do as well, what they're supposed to do, which is, to integrate lots of different factions, to broker deals, to tie elites to populism. I mean, Macron does. It's not really a party as we would understand it. It's people who.
It's not a party at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's people who've hitched their wagons to him. So, in that respect, I just don't think that you're getting parties that are functioning. And I think there's indications of the same sort of thing with the Conservative Party. The membership has dropped. And, just look at the misbehavior of the people who go into politics in Britain. I mean, right now they're having a rash of scandals about people placing bets on the outcome of the election. These are, the equivalent of congressmen doing this, including some who are, interestingly enough, betting against their own reelection.
Yeah, no, it's really something. Well, look, the Gaullists in France also had kind of a meltdown, right? The leader of the RN, the Rump Gaullist party that was led by President Sarkozy, who's been also adjudicated as essentially for corruption. Chirac was convicted, of course. So there's been plenty of corruption on the Gaullist side. But the leader of the Gaullist party wanted to make common cause with Le Pen, and then was sort of voted out by his sort of mates and the party leadership, but not before he'd locked them out of the headquarters. And it was really a kind of opera bouffe. But and they're down also very low in the polls. But it looks like the Gaullists won't be much of a factor. It's really pretty striking that these sort of long-time governing parties are now reduced. Same with the Democristiana in Italy. These parties have just been reduced to nothing. And I think some of what we're seeing with the rise of the populist right, I think you put your finger on earlier in the conversation, has to do with the failure of elites, the failure of traditional parties, and their failure in particular to effectively govern.
Yeah, and you see it in Germany as well. I guess there was always something fatuous about the idea, that the EU would somehow guarantee that life in Europe would just be, kind of wonderful and benign, and problems
Utopia.
could be solved essentially administratively without real, honest to God politics.
Right.
Now, I mean, as Americans, we're not really in any position to talk. Well, maybe we can talk about the oddly interesting Iranian elections.
Yeah. So, I mean, in keeping with the um, theme of throw the incumbents out,
Right.
the most of the reformist candidates were eliminated from contention by the so-called guardianship council, which sort of determines who may and who may not run in the sort of weird guided democracy that is Iran, a sort of this electoral authoritarian theocratic regime. So to keep up pretenses, they had to let some reformer in, and so they let this gentleman in, Mr. Pezeshkian, who was a kind of really middle rank reformer. I guess he'd been a minister in Khatami's government back in the late 90s, early 2000s. But because the conservatives were divided, in particular between Qalibaf and Saaed Jalili, there's now pressure for one of them to drop out so that there could be a united front against this reform candidate. And it's hard to know exactly what's going on always with Iran, but some of this may just be actually the supreme leader manipulating this to try and create interest in the election. Because one of the things that's really striking was what polling tells you is that most Iranians don't, intend to show up, that they'll be lucky if they get 40% of the electorate out for this election, which they're desperately trying to do in order to kind of shore up its legitimacy.
Yeah, that was the road I was going to go down. That I think the Iranians are very good at creating shams and diverting their own population from some pretty severe domestic problems. And the real issue that they will confront sooner or later is when President Khatami finally goes, which can't happen soon enough. But meanwhile, there's another angle on Iran which I think we should talk about. So you and I have talked a lot about the Middle East situation. We have talked about the chances that there will be I wouldn't say a war between Israel and Hezbollah, because that's going on every day, actually, at levels of violence which, if Gaza weren't around, would be on the front pages. You do hear more and more talk out of Israel that they will sooner or later roll the iron dice, as Bateman Holvig put it, and conduct a major military operation. The thought that occurs to me is that from the Iranian point of view, and I really hate to say this, you get the impression that they and their allies, in this case including Sinwar in Gaza, think this is all working. You've got this, you've had this ferocious fighting in Gaza, which has undoubtedly killed a lot of Palestinian civilians. There's an enormous amount of turmoil in the West Bank. We don't hear much about that, but it's going on. Continuous level of fighting between Hezbollah and the Israelis. And they can throw a huge punch against the Israelis. Now, it didn't land anywhere, but they did it, and nobody really punished them for it. You have Houthis, now hitting ships occasionally. Nobody's doing anything about that. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're the ones who are thinking, well, maybe now's the time for us to roll the iron dice and achieve. And I say this particularly because maybe it's just the impact of my own age. I think as these guys get older and get to the end of their political careers and indeed their lifespans, they may have some really big thing they want to achieve. And I think if you're Khatami, if you could be the leader of the Muslim world who either destroys Israel or so damages it that it's on the path to failure, understood in some way, that could be very appealing. Now that could also end up with nuclear weapons going off. I mean, it's that level of risk.
I guess I'm concerned that there could be conflict in the north for sure. Although I tend to think that it would be more likely to come by miscalculation or mistake and accident as opposed to intent. Because right now it looks to me like both sides have lots of reasons not to want this to blow up. I mean, first of all, the Iranians are in the middle of this election, and the election is really a precursor to the larger issue, which is the succession to Khamenei. There's some talk that Khamenei wants to install his son Mujtaba. There's not a tradition of that. Of course, there's not that much tradition for the Islamic Republic. They've only had two supreme leaders. So, I'm not sure how much stock to put in the notion that they don't want to have a dynastic succession, although, people like our friend Ray Takei said, no, that would be really very un-Islamic and there'd be a lot of, problems with that. I mean, that's why this whole thing has been a little bit uncomfortable, because Raisi looked like he was going to be the successor, and that would have been fine, from the point of view of the clerics. But now it's very unsettled. They have to be concerned. I mean, Benny Gantz just said, look, if there's a war, it's going to be bad for everybody because, but we're going to turn the lights out in Beirut, he said, and you're not, no one's going to wish that they were in Beirut instead of Jerusalem if this happens. And that's something that the Iranians have to take seriously. I mean, they did fire off these 300, missiles and ballistic and cruise missiles and UAVs in April, but also, most of them landed with no effect. I mean, they didn't have that much effect. Now, in a war with Hezbollah, it'll be different because it won't be as easy to defend. The arsenal of missiles is there. First of all, they're closer. There's less warning time, and the numbers are just daunting in terms of defending. So there would be a lot of damage in Israel, and the Israelis have their own reasons, I think, not to want to go to war right now. I mean, one is the IDF is pretty exhausted from the last 7 months of fighting. They need obviously some time to refit, replenish, restore their rest and restore their forces. The economy has suffered enormously. A big war with Lebanon would only, create even more economic damage. So I've tended to see what we're hearing from Bibi and others Israelis saying we're ready to go north as kind of jawboning to try and get, there's this U.S.-French mediation effort to try and get the Hezbollah forces back where they are supposed to be, north of the Litani, according to the UN Security Council resolution that ended the war in 2006. And from the Iranian side, Nasrallah saying that I'm going to attack Cyprus. I think that's been an effort mostly to sort of excite the U.S., Greece, and Turkey to kind of rein in the Israelis. So I see signs that both sides are, maneuvering and positioning and want to avoid war. However, having said all that, you've got large populations in both southern Lebanon and northern Israel that have been evacuated and who want to go home. And they're going to have to go home at some point. So, and as you say, there's been firing constantly across the blue line by both sides. I'm not trying to, that's not a statement of moral equivalence. I'm just saying that there's been, a lot of fire exchanged, mostly, instigated by Hezbollah, almost always instigated by Hezbollah. So there's plenty of opportunity for something to go badly wrong here and lead to an escalatory spiral. But my sense is, at least for the moment, both sides would like to avoid that if possible.
So I hope you're right. The reason why I'm not quite as optimistic on that one is the Israeli mood is existential. Once people think that existence is on the line, they just don't judge things the way you and I do. On the Hezbollah/Iranian side, first, I think the Iranians, in some cases, completely willing to fight to the last Lebanese. But more importantly, I think they look at Gaza and they say, oh, yeah, terrible. Lots of civilians killed. That's, the price you pay. The Israelis have not been able to get a hold of Sinwar. They've not been able to take out several others of the top people. They're under a lot of international pressure and isolation, which from the Iranian point of view is good. They've taken casualties. The urban terrain turns out to be really difficult, and Hezbollah has done very similar things in southern Lebanon. So why not? And as I said, it's not existential for them, obviously, but it is. This may be one of those. The moment has come, and we have a historical opportunity, and people think about it as windows of opportunity. I don't think that's the right way to frame it. But it's that there's a moment. There's that Bismarck quote that I listen for the steps of God through history, and then I reach out and grab the hem of his cloak. And I think that's sort of that kind of mood translated into Persian is what I would be concerned about. And I have to say, I mean, once again, I don't think the administration has done anybody any favors by failing to say the kinds of things that might deter the Iranians, which is, oh yeah, you guys will be obliterated, and we'll be backing the Israelis while they do it. And this could fall on your heads as well. Our notion of deterrence is so antiseptic compared to these other people. Nasrallah's idea of deterrence is, I'll destroy Cyprus. Our idea of deterrence is, that we're not entirely sure we can back the Israelis as much as we would like to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest factor that undermines the Israeli deterrent posture has been the spats with the U.S. in particular. I mean, I do think that Amos Hochstein, the envoy for Lebanon, has made some statements saying, "Look, we may not be able to hold the Israelis back, and if it gets into a fight, we'll support them, etc." But the constant squabbling between Biden and Bibi, and both sides, frankly, I think bear some of the onus here. Has undermined, I think, the deterrent posture for sure. On the other hand, Iran has invested a lot in Hezbollah, and I don't think they want to see happen to Hezbollah what's happened to Hamas, which is basically the military infrastructure, completely destroyed, because it serves their interests to have that sitting there on Israel's border, but not destroyed. So I take your point that there are probably a lot of people in the IRGC who are all too happy to let Lebanon bear the brunt of this, but there is a sunk cost there that I think they don't want to lose. So
I think that's right. The one last thing I would just say on that one is I forget who I was talking to about this. It was an expert on Hezbollah, and what they were saying is that the relationship between Hezbollah and the Iranians is sort of like the teacher who has an absolutely brilliant student, who the teacher is still the teacher, and the student treats them with respect. Just not talking about the United States, obviously, but on certain things, the teacher lets the student take the lead, or heeds the student's views, or is not willing to tell the student don't do this. And I suppose the big question ultimately is, I guess I do think Nasrallah is different from Sinwar. Sinwar, I think, really is a psychopath. I mean, he's willing to see every last Gazan get killed if he could destroy Israel doing that.
Oh yeah, I mean the tapes that have come out and the statements he's made. We have the Israelis right where we want them. I mean, it's obviously a psychopathic view.
He's clearly a psychopath. Nasrallah is of southern Lebanon, and those are his people. And I think Hezbollah is of that place, and I find it difficult to imagine that they really would be completely indifferent to, everything south of Beirut being turned into a shattered desert.
Yeah, no, I agree. Maybe we should talk about that other election that's looming, in November. So you and I were having an exchange this morning about the piece that Robert O'Brien has written for Foreign Affairs. So what do you think a second Trump term, which increasingly, depressingly, looks like at least a 50-50 possibility
So
would look like in foreign affairs.
as usual, you're being excessively polite, Eric. You didn't quite say, "You credulous nitwit, how could you possibly believe any of that tripe?" But I could read the thought bubbles. I know you well enough by now. But the piece we were referring to is by Robert O'Brien in Foreign Affairs. We both knew Robert O'Brien in an earlier incarnation when he was involved marginally in the Romney campaign, and he behaved like a perfectly normal foreign policy Republican. He got into the Trump administration, and some people feel that he has a good shot at again being national security advisor, and it's
Or
his
Secretary of State or Defense.
I'm still wrapping my head around any of those. But it's an article that attempts to lay out a Trump foreign policy vision. Now, whether this is authorized, whether this is him trying to set the table, whether it's him, just trying to put some points on the board, I don't know. But in all seriousness, I think you and I did disagree a bit, and I think it would be worth teasing this out. I mean, I think Trump would be a disaster in many, many ways. I think domestically it would be dangerous, although I think the republic would still stand. I don't think we would become a despotic state. I don't even think he could do the kinds of things that Modi has done in India. And even Modi, I think, is encountering the limits of what happens when you really try to impose forms of tyranny in a large, diverse, fractious democracy, and ours is much better established and all that. The question is on foreign policy. And I think I'm slightly less pessimistic than you, and I phrase it that way advisedly, for a bunch of reasons. First, so in other words, what would be the great fear? The great fear would be Trump is simply an isolationist, or he's even worse, he's completely in Vladimir Putin's hip pocket, and he kind of throws the weight of the United States onto the side of the axis of evil. I don't think he would do that. I think the more serious danger is that he's essentially a transactional isolationist. And, O'Brien in his way, as H.R. McMaster, by the way, did during his time in the Trump administration, tried to say no, 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 while saying he's simply much more assertive. And I don't really take their words at face value, but here's why I don't think it would work out that way. First, Trump doesn't stay bought. So it's not like Putin has bought him. There is no scandal that Vladimir Putin can reveal about him. He has no levers on him. That relationship, to the extent there was any kind of relationship, was there before. I don't think it's here now after several years of war. I think the other countries and liberal democracies actually are going to be better at manipulating him. Remember how good the Japanese were? If you remember during the Trump administration, I hate to say the first Trump administration, during the Trump administration, when he went in, because he had vaguely heard in the 1980s that the Japanese were eating our lunch, he was quite hostile to Japan. And that got turned around. And it got turned around, and the Japanese were very effective at playing him. I think there'd be a bunch of people who'd be effective at playing him, starting with the Poles, who have already done it to some extent. I think, moreover, in foreign policy, there is a way in which presidents have much less choice than they think, unless they can act really consistently over a sustained period of time along multiple lines of effort, sort of the way FDR did to prepare us for World War II and to get us into World War II. But as we all know, Trump is a completely incoherent individual at the best of times. And, he's getting older, and that makes him even kind of goofier that way. And so I think to some extent the logic of events will keep him more or less where he is. And to the extent that he has said anything, let's just talk about Ukraine for a moment. he has said, well, yeah, we'll give the Ukrainians all the weapons, but we'll make the Europeans pay for it. Or we give them the weapons and it's a loan. So that's already a very different place. Very last thing I would say, and this I really feel badly saying, that don't kick me off the podcast for it. There were some things he did that are okay. I've been in Europe, as you know, quite a bit. He scared the Europeans witless this time around. They are scared witless of what happened. Their reaction is to do what we want them to do, which is to increase defense spending and say, well, let's take our own defense somewhat seriously. Middle East, he's fine. He's always been tough on China. Now he'll cut a deal with anybody, to be sure. But on the basic outlines, it's okay. And the fact of the matter is, on illegal immigration, he's where most Americans are. So the thing that really cuts close to home. So none of that is to say this would be anything good. It would be terrible. It's to say that it wouldn't, in the same way as I don't think it would be the end of the republic domestically, I don't think it would be the end of the world internationally, although it would most definitely not be good, and it would be worse than the Biden administration.
Well, Eliot, I will say that I'm glad that you have, been becalmed by the soothing words of Robert O'Brien in Foreign Affairs, although he's already eaten some of them. I mean, he's already said that the idea of putting all the Marines in the Far East, he's now walked that idea back. And I'm glad that you're reassured that the transition to Trump will be led by our former colleague Kyron Skinner, in the State Department, and Christopher Miller in the Department of Defense. But I am not reassured. First of all, Robert's article describes retrospectively a Trump administration that did not exist, except in perhaps Robert's mind. It sort of acts as if the world was a totally benign place, and everybody was living in fear of Donald Trump's Ronald Reagan-esque appeal to peace through strength, which lasted through 2 budget cycles. Look, I am both more concerned on the domestic side and on the foreign side. And part of it is because I don't think there are going to be figures in this administration like a Jim Mattis or an H.R. McMaster or even Robert to some degree, although Robert was not much of a restraint on Trump when he was national security advisor.
At all, actually.
Yeah. So, you're not going to have those kinds of people. Instead, you're going to have the kind of people who are being vetted by Johnny McEntee and Russ Vought and Project 2025, true believers. And we've already had one example just in the last day or two, breaking out, which is the quote plan for Ukraine, for ending the war in Ukraine that was presented to Trump by Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleitz, who was the chief of staff for John Bolton and then stayed on for a while in the Trump National Security Council, which essentially would ratify, sort of force Ukraine to negotiate with Russia on the basis of the lines as they currently exist. And they would threaten Russia that unless Russia negotiated too, they would fully support Ukraine. But the reality will be Russia will accept that deal and then negotiate with Ukraine the way they have in the Minsk I and Minsk II processes, totally in bad faith, while they continue to occupy, 20% of Ukraine's territory. And while I'm sure they would continue to talk and fight. So, I think what you would see is a shredding of alliances. I take the point that Trump scared the Europeans straight into spending more on defense. I think he had a little bit to do with that. It had already started, frankly, even during the Obama years because of the pressure from Bob Gates and others. And I think the real thing that scared them straight was Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine in February 2022. So I don't think I give Trump a little bit of credit, but I wouldn't give him all of the credit, for that. So I think you're going to see, civil servants shunted aside, if not fired. I think you'll see a kind of pretty much an end to the civil service system and a return to the spoils system. Yes, there'll be lots of litigation. Yes, I think, there's a law in the books, which is probably unconstitutional, that says he can't pull out of NATO. It's probably a prohibited legislative veto under the Chadha decision of the Supreme Court. But of course, it'll get litigated rather, if he tries to do it. But there are a lot of ways he can damage NATO without actually pulling the United States out. So I think it will be quite catastrophic if he returns to office. I think he will be even less controllable, more unhinged. He's clearly suffering from serious cognitive decline. I mean, he keeps accusing Biden of being, suffering from dementia. But the truth is, everything that Donald Trump does is a case of projection, of accusing his adversaries of doing precisely, what he is doing. And I think it will be a bigger threat to the Republic than you're suggesting, in part because I have a very strong sense of the frailty of republics historically. We were just talking about that with Chris Lynch last week. We were talking about Machiavelli. And so I'm very, very, very concerned about what a second Trump term would bring.
So, God, you make me feel naive and weak, and I just believe in butterflies and unicorns. Would you feel, this is so depressing, and on my vacation too. Thanks a lot, pal. Having a nice time with my granddaughter in Boston. And you got to do
I think
this.
you should continue to do that. I've been spending a lot of time watching hockey. I watched the Stanley Cup finals. I watched just about every game. I've even watched the American Hockey League Calder Cup. Hershey Bears win their second Calder Cup in a row just to take my mind off of all of this.
Yeah, I once went to a riot and a hockey game broke out. I'll concede a lot of your points. Would you feel differently if Tom Cotton were Secretary of Defense and or Mike Pompeo with somebody like Cotton as Secretary of State?
I would say I would feel marginally better about that. I do think the vice presidential nomination does matter in that sense. As bad as Marco Rubio has been on a lot of issues as he's sucked up to Trump and turned himself into a kind of, national conservative, I would feel better with him or Burgum as vice president than I would with J.D. Vance. But it's marginal. It's at the margin, because in the end of the day, all of them are just going to do what Trump wants.
Do you think we'll be allowed to podcast from prison?
I don't know what kind of Wi-Fi they have in Guantanamo. It's probably better than what I have at my house, which is why I'm podcasting from an unknown location.
Well, what we'll do is we're going to, in the remaining months, what we'll do is we'll teach our listeners the prison codes. We kind of tap on the walls to each other, and we'll see if we can do a podcast that way. It may take a while to get through it. So,
all right. Well, I think we've ended on a sufficiently down note for Shield of the Republic. In fact, it's so down that we're now going to take a 2-week vacation and hiatus to allow our listeners to recover. We'll be back in mid-July after the holiday, and we'll have some election results to chew over and some other topics. And if we're lucky, we'll have some very good historians coming on to discuss some very interesting books. But for now, I think we've done enough damage to our listeners' psyches.
I don't know why I'm laughing. Have a good time off, Eric.
You too, Eliot. Thank you.